Our reading this morning will be from the first book of Genesis, chapter 29, and verses 15 through 20. Genesis 29, 15 through 20. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her.
Good morning, church.
Good morning.
It's good to see everyone this morning. I'm going to just assume that, especially for many of you men, that your wallets are probably very empty after the last couple of days because we've celebrated Valentine's Day. Of course, if you haven't been with us, we've been doing a series on love and different types of love that are found in the Bible and some of the different Greek words that are associated with that. And so this morning we're going to be talking about the love of attraction. We're going to be talking about what attracts us to one another, and of course we're going to look at a biblical perspective on that. But you know, whenever we think about romantic love, whenever we think about what has led many of the couples that are sitting in this room together, what has led you together, started out as just a feeling, didn't it? Started out that whenever you looked at that other person, that you had butterflies. And then it blossomed into something even bigger, something even greater. You know, when I think about love today, and I think about the marital relationship, I don't want this to be too many examples about my family, but I think about honesty. And I think about how it has just blossomed into that whenever couples can be honest with one another, that brings about security. And that, in effect, brings about continued butterflies in our lives. For instance, when I think about mine and Jeannie's relationship, I think about this morning. And before I came to church this morning, because we drove separately, but before I came, I said, "How do I look, Jeannie?" And she said, "Well, you kind of look like Bill Nye the Science Guy." I thought, well, that's great. I'm going to go preach about Jesus and I look like a profound atheist. So what better of a combination? But I could ask her that question and I knew she was going to be honest with me. So if I needed to make some changes, maybe I should have. If I needed to make some changes, I knew that I could trust her to tell me what I needed to do. And I love her because of that. But that's not how our love for one another began. It began because we saw one another. Or I guess I better say it began because I saw her. I don't know if she saw as much in me at the very beginning. But then it progressed to dating. And then it progressed to spending some Valentine's days together of giving gifts to one another and celebrating that love. Valentine's Day is a very interesting thing because we make such a big deal out of it, and we do a whole lot to impress our significant other or the one that we're dating during this particular day. On this day that we celebrated on Friday, a day set aside to celebrate the expression of romantic love, it's interesting the lengths that we go to in America to impress our significant other. As a matter of fact, Americans are estimated to spend about $18.2 billion a year on this day on flowers, chocolates, and jewelry alone. That's a whole lot of money that's being dished out for our significant others. And that comes out to about an average of $136 per person whenever we think about that. Now, I imagine that this average is probably spread out among the entire population of the United States. I know that there's no 3-year-olds out there that are probably spending money on Valentine's Day. However, I will have to brag on my son because he's got more swag than I do. He's already proposed to Emma Grothouse, and the other day, whenever we dropped Hallie and Levi off at the Grothouse's house, he said, I want to get Emma some stuff for Valentine's Day. We were like, okay. So he grabbed his own Christmas money, and he bought her a rose and a balloon. And so he's starting early. He's starting ahead. So we're going to have to watch that boy big time. But it's all because even at that young of an age, he really, really likes her. And really, they're just buddies. They're video game buddies, and they love to play together and all of that. Maybe one day it will blossom into something even bigger. We've already set up that arranged marriage, so maybe it will happen. But love does some funny things to men and women, doesn't it? Love makes us do some crazy things for one another. Sometimes we might even say that in some situations, love blinds us because we might be so infatuated with a particular person that sometimes in a bad way we might fail to see their faults, but sometimes in a good way, our infatuation with another person lets us know and helps to remind us that that person isn't going to be and doesn't have to be perfect, because no one is. But love certainly does some funny things to us. Well, we talked before about unconditional love, and we've talked about brotherly love, or that family love that we ought to have for one another. And both of those types of love most certainly apply to a love that a man and a woman need to have between one another. But those two types of love don't really address that special kind of love that you do see between a man and a woman. And that love that you do see eventually between a husband and a wife. But romantic love and attraction is really where this journey all begins. Attraction has always been associated with romance. And this morning it's going to be kind of interesting because, like I said, we're talking about different Greek words, especially words that are used in the Bible to describe love. But the word that we're going to talk about this morning, you can't find anywhere in the Bible. You can only find its concept. We're going to talk about the Greek word eros. Eros means passionate love or a romantic love for another. However, it is also where we get the word erotic. And whenever you think about the word erotic, most definitely you probably don't think about romance. You think more in the realm of pornography and things of that nature. Things that spur on lust between a man and a woman. But as a matter of fact, this is kind of an interesting word because it isn't in the Bible. This idea of romantic love, or this word talking about romantic love, most notably probably because it has pagan ties. As a matter of fact, the word eros is actually the name of the Greek god of love. Probably why we don't find it in God's Word. But it was also connected to the Roman equivalent of that. Most of you guys know that when you combine the Greek and the Roman cultures, They're very, very similar. As a matter of fact, the Romans borrowed a lot of things from the Greek. As a matter of fact, whenever you think about all the mythological Greek gods that are in mythology, that are in existence within that realm, the Romans had an exact equivalent to every single one of them. Whenever you think about the top dog, whenever you think about Zeus, the Romans called Zeus Jupiter. Just look at our planets if you want to know all the equivalents. And of course, their equivalent to Hades or Satan would be Pluto. And we still argue whether or not that's a planet today, don't we? So the Romans would call Eros, who we commonly know as today, as Cupid. And how often do we buy a card for Valentine's Day that might have a picture of Cupid on there? Because, of course, just in our culture and funnily speaking, we talk about how people, whenever they get those butterflies and whenever love is in the air, it's because Cupid has shot them with an arrow, right? So that's really steeped and really embedded even in our culture today. Whenever we think about this passionate or romantic love, we think of Cupid. And we don't think of that in really a negative or a sinful way whatsoever. And so I think that's okay to have fun with that. But that's kind of where the origins came from. Is that when somebody fell head over heels for someone, just by looking at them, that supposed love at first sight, it was because they were smited with the god of love, or they were hit with one of Cupid's arrows. The interesting thing about comparing what we see, especially in the cultural time of the Bible, and then the Bible itself, and the fact that we don't really see that word eros within God's Word, the closest thing that we can come up with that really matches the concept of eros love, that romantic love or that passionate love, is the word desire. Now, I understand that the word desire can have a lot of implications to it that don't necessarily have to do with romance. Whenever we have a desire to do something, we have a unique and a powerful passion to do those things or to be involved in those things, right? And so that's how far the definition of desire might go with us. But I do want to address this morning how this idea of eros, or this idea of desire, has kind of taken hold of our culture in some negative ways. And I just want to do that very quickly. But I want you to think about the world today. I want you to think about whenever we look at the wide range or the entire span of what Valentine's Day is all about. I want you to think about the pressures that this world and that society puts on even Christian young people when it comes to what is Valentine's Day supposed to be all about. You know, along with your flowers, your chocolates, your jewelry, another one of the largest sellers, another one of the largest selling items for Valentine's Day is erotic lingerie. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with lingerie. Married couples, you do whatever you want. I don't want to ask any questions in your home, okay? But the thing is that most of the people buying that stuff probably are not married to one another. Meaning that around holidays like Valentine's Day, they either make the decision to or they are pressured into going above and beyond what couples as unmarried couples are really supposed to be involved in and what they're supposed to be doing together, because society says this is how you express your love to one another. So in the world today, showing love to a lot of people, showing love means engaging in passionate physical acts with one another. And I think we need to take a good look at this and understand that that really isn't the epitome of romantic love. That's not the epitome of what romantic love is supposed to be about. Now, undoubtedly, we can't express our love to one another physically. We're talking about desire, and we're talking about attraction. Whenever a guy and a girl or a man and a woman are attracted to one another, we are drawn to one another to want to touch one another, to want to embrace, to want to kiss. That's most definitely part of our physical and natural attraction toward one another. But is that really supposed to be the epitome of what romantic love is? I think that we can, going ahead, I think that we can too often fall into the world's idea that showing love means engaging in passionate physical acts. And oftentimes, when those physical acts are done, it's too often to fulfill selfish desires. When we think about the phrase to make love with one another, I guess I better say cover your kids' ears, right? No, I'm not going to get any deeper than that. But we hear that idea in society. Why do we hear that idea in our society so much? Because that is looked at as the epitome of, the end-all expression of a man and a woman's love toward one another. Well, folks, if it stops there, if it ends there, then we're not looking at true love. Some would say that that expression of love must take place before a man and a woman commit their lives to one another for the rest of their lives. And I think that's a big misunderstanding to what true love really is all about. But we can get sidetracked by the world about what love and about what romance is in fact supposed to be. We need to be very, very careful. And I want to talk about this for just a moment. That God warns us of the dangers of desire. And you could say the dangers sometimes of attraction and how we need to be careful of that sometimes. We do need to be cautious in our lives. Desire can, if we allow it, desire can lead to sin. It doesn't always, and not all desire is sinful. But we need to understand that it can do that sometimes. I want to take a look at James chapter 1, verses 14 to 15. This is where James is telling his readers, okay, this is how sin basically takes place. And sometimes sin can kind of creep up on us. Sometimes sin comes out of nowhere, and we need to be very, very careful about that. We need to be very, very careful in our everyday lives about being on guard for ourselves. And this passage is not meant to be just focusing on the idea of romance and the idea of physical attraction. This passage actually talks about all kinds of desire. The desires to fulfill the flesh, the desires to satisfy our needs, or to satisfy our wants in many cases. And that's what this passage talks about. Let's read that together. But each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Notice how James here is talking about, this occurs this comes about in a step-by-step process. When something happens one step after another, it can very easily sneak up on us if we're not careful. That's how sin works. It's how it's always worked. If the devil roams around like a roaring lion seeking who he may devour, think about how quickly a lion can sneak up upon its prey. It inches for his prey, little by little, until finally he just jumps and devours. And if we're not careful, sinful desire can do the same thing to us. To go along with that, we can look at Jude, verse 7. Jude only has one chapter. Jude chapter 1 and verse 7. Here, Jude makes reference to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that we find in the book of Genesis. Really close to the beginning of the civilized world or mankind. But we know that Sodom and Gomorrah were cities that had engaged in so much evil. I do want to make sure that we're very clear with something here, though. I think too often, what Christians do is they go back to Sodom and Gomorrah and they just want to talk about homosexuality. Folks, that's not the only thing that was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of infidelity. There was a lot of anti-God. There was a lot of immoral living. And it doesn't just span over one particular sin. And that's what I want us to understand about Sodom and Gomorrah. But it says, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, by the way, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural, another word that you could use there is different desire, served as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. And so basically what was taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah were the indulgence of natural and unnatural desires that were done in a context, obviously, that was not pleasing to God. Sexual immorality, if you have an older Bible translation, you're probably going to see the word there, fornication. And fornication is a very general term that talks about any type of sexual immorality, any type of sexual relationship that is done outside the confines of marriage. Because the confines of marriage is the boundary by which God wanted that relationship to take place. And he says here, in those cities, you had unhealthy attractions or desires that were being indulged in. The people allowed their desires to be overtaken. They allowed themselves to be overtaken by those desires. And they indulged in those things that were sinful, therefore leading to the destruction of those cities. Desire, though, can lead to sin. We're told in the book of Romans that sin, even whenever we think of it spiritually speaking, that sin leads to death. And one thing that I want us to understand about our desires, our passions, our attractions, is that it was never meant for us to fulfill every single desire that we have in our life. I can think of it even in a non-relationship or a non-relational way. How many of us would absolutely love, or we have this desire that we would absolutely love to be filthy rich? But how many of us are never going to get there? How many of us, even though we have that temptation or that desire to have a whole lot of money, know that having all the money in the world isn't going to bring us happiness. And so we put a roadblock there and we say, I'm not going to try to get all the money in the world because I know that I'll never be satisfied. I know that I will never attain to a height of happiness that most people think that it's going to get you. And so I'm going to lay that desire to the side. Folks, we need to look at all desire in that way. That just because we might naturally desire something doesn't mean that it's something that we should or can indulge in. I think about 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 3. Passage that I'm not going to necessarily read word for word, but this is where the wisest man in the entire world made the dumbest mistake. Over a period of time, mind you. But he made the dumbest mistake he ever could. King Solomon had a very, very large desire, a very large appetite for women. This actually came up in our Bible Jeopardy last night about Solomon's desire for that. But how demeaning is this even today? Whenever we would think about this in our society today, I know maybe many of you have probably seen a show on television called Sister Wives. And of course that's a look into some of the more strict Mormon communities that still exist today, where a man has several wives living in this community or even under the same roof. And what that show really brings to light is all of the issues, all of the problems that brings about. But the problems aren't there just with the man. The problems are there with the women, causing jealousy and things like that. The Bible tells us in those 3 verses that Solomon was enticed by many foreign women, many of them being princesses. How did he come across these women? A lot of times he came across these women in deals with other countries. The leaders and the kings of these other countries, in order to bridge an alliance between them and Israel and King Solomon, they would gift him with one of their virgin daughters, and she would become his wife. When it was all said and done, Solomon had 700 wives. Okay, that's way more than enough right there, right? But he wasn't done there. On top of that, he had 300 concubines. Now, there's a lot of speculation of what that entailed as far as their role, but he had many children even by these concubines who were not labeled as his wives. And a majority of these wives were foreign, and those wives were worshipers of foreign gods. And in all of his lust and in all of his desire for these women, and to make them happy and to fulfill his duties with them, if you want to call it that, he adopted their religions. And he went after all of these other gods. You see, allowing himself to indulge in these desires that he never should have indulged in, say with one woman to be faithful with, he forgot all about the God that even put him in the place that he was. He forgot all about the God that had given him more wisdom than any other human being had been granted in human record. He put all of that aside, and he put his relationship with God aside, because he allowed his desires and his sinful desires to rule over his life. And we can see where it got him. It wasn't until later on in his life, as he's writing the book of Ecclesiastes, where he says, vanity of vanity. All of life is vanity. And when he concludes the book, he said, the end of all things is this: fear the Lord and keep His commandments. That's what I should have done all along. Solomon was living in this idea of repentance and regret, saying, what was I thinking? Well, you're a man, for one thing, Solomon. And you did a lot of stupid things. A lot of stupid things. It's because he allowed indulgences or desires to get out of control and to go places that they should not have gone. And even so, he was told in the midst of all of this happening, not just at the end of his life, but whenever you look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 11, as Solomon is being addressed by the Lord, it says, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you've not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Of course, we know that a generation later, God's kingdom was divided into two. And the southern kingdom, or the part that Solomon had ruled over, that was all he got, was one tribe. That was all his descendants got, was one tribe. And the kingdom was divided because Solomon's heart was divided between the true God and other gods. Our desires can sometimes be deceiving. Our desires and attractions can sometimes lead us down roads that we don't need to go. And we need to be careful and conscious of those things. Now on to a more positive note. I also want us to understand that romantic companionship was a gift of God from the very beginning. Now all we have to do, obviously, is look at Genesis 2, verses 24 through 25, which we are going to look at in just a moment. What Adam said when woman was created. But I also want us to think about this, that in Genesis 3 and verse 16, after Adam and Eve had been deceived by Satan, and God has this conversation with Adam and Eve. He talks to her about childbearing. He talks to Adam about how both of their lives are going to be difficult because they indulged in some of their own desires. Their desire to have knowledge, or as much knowledge as God, and to be as powerful as God. You know, Satan had talked them into having those desires and going after those things. But in God's conversation with Eve, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, he says, your desire shall be toward your husband. He says, I want you to be faithful and keep that desire for him. Now the same thing obviously would go for Adam. That he would need to put his focus upon her and be focused together as a couple and as a team to do the right things, to have the right desires in the right direction. But he says, your desire shall be for your husband. And as I said about Genesis 2, verses 24 through 25, Adam himself was attracted enough to Eve. He had this attraction. He had this eros, this love for her in a way that he makes that statement in chapter 2, verses 24 through 25. Because attraction and fulfilling that attraction between one another should be centered around commitment. True love, true eros, true attraction and true and faithful desire to your significant other should be centered around commitment. I've got two passages that I want to read. First of all, it's the passage in Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 through 25. And then we'll go to Ephesians 5, verses 25 through 28, which is on the front of our bulletins this morning. But Genesis 2, 24 through 25 says, "Therefore," and this is Adam talking, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were unashamed." They were physically attracted to one another just as much. And I think physical attraction is extremely important in any relationship. If you're not physically attracted to one another, that can most definitely bring about some problems within a relationship and within a marriage. Again, I think that's what initially brings a couple together, is that physical attraction, that butterflies you get just whenever you look upon a woman or you look upon a man. And you recognize the beauty of them being a creation of God. And that you just think that they're the most absolute beautiful thing that you've ever seen. First time I ever saw Jeannie, I did a triple take. I said, "Who is that?" And I had to be very careful because this was at a teen devotional that her sister was hosting. But I was like, wow, who is she? Matter of fact, it was pretty awesome because I just lived down the street from her mom and dad. So I just invited myself over for dinner one time so I could get myself in the door. I could pursue this just a little bit more. I was physically attracted to her. And there was nothing wrong with that. I recognized the beauty of God's creation within her. And I wanted to be around her. I wanted to be able to see her beauty. I wanted to be able to get to know her, and I wanted to be able to hear her voice. And let me tell you, a guy that lived in the north all of his life, when he hears a Southern Belle's voice, he'll get you quick. But those were things that attracted me to her initially. And I know that we all have similar stories in that realm. But in order to fulfill that attraction that I had, as our relationship progressed, it needed to center around commitment. And that's when we both left father and mother, and we clung together as husband and wife to spend the rest of our lives together. And that passage is reiterated by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4. This was in Jesus' talk with disciples and obviously with some Pharisees to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He said, "I want to tell you how it was supposed to be from the very beginning. The man and woman would be attracted to one another. And in showing the commitment of that attraction, they would bind themselves as husband and wife." Ephesians 5 and verse 31 also talks about that binding of one another. But I want us to go real quickly to Ephesians 5, verses 25 through 28. This is of the most importance whenever we think about keeping the romance alive in our relationships. It does extend to agape or unconditional love, and it extends to family relational love, on how we feel and how we act toward that significant other. And husbands, this passage really more so picks on you a little bit, and I think it's okay for that. But it says, "Husbands, love your wives." Again, the word there is agapeo. Show love to them without condition, as Christ loved the church. How far did that love go? And he gave himself up for her. that he might sanctify or purify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Now, folks, I don't want to get too far off topic, especially because of our time, and I want to say this very, very quickly. In this same grouping of verses previously, it talks about the wife submitting to her husband. But I think that our culture, our society has a really, really skewed and bad idea of what submission is, and that's why that word has been seen as a cuss word. In the passage that we just read, we are told right off the bat that submission between a husband and wife, and even submitting to one another, doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to your spouse. It doesn't mean that you can leave bruises and things of that nature whenever you disagree with one another. As a matter of fact, when it says that Christ left the church without spot or blemish, he's saying that's how a husband and wife relationship should be. And I think that even goes in how we handle arguments and disagreements with one another. We can argue sometimes and we can disagree. But do we do so with respect for one another? Do we do so understanding that their flesh is my flesh, their blood is my blood, and I need to treat them in that way? Am I committed to them in that way? Do I treat them in such a way that it's not always about fulfilling my desires and my attractions, but what this love is and should be all about is fulfilling and seeking the good and the needs of the other person. That's what this love is supposed to be all about. And this kind of love motivated man to work for his bride. In the passage that was read a while ago, in Genesis chapter 29, we see where Jacob was seeking a bride. And mind you, he was seeking a bride from some of his own people that knew God and loved God and respected God. And so he wanted to make sure that he did not pick someone from a pagan society that did not have that relationship with God. And so he goes to Laban's house, who was a distant relative of his. Long story short, there's a lot of drama in this story, as there are in a lot of Old Testament stories. But I want us to concentrate on this. That as soon as he saw her, Jacob was attracted to Rachel, wasn't he? He was attracted to Rachel. He knew when he saw her that was the woman he wanted to get to know better, and essentially the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. So much so that he said, I will work in order to be able to have her for my wife. He worked for 7 years, and then his eventual father-in-law tricked him into marrying Rachel's sister Leah. That's where the drama comes in. And he says, hey, you tricked me. And he says, you work another 7 years, and I'll let you marry Rachel. What did Jacob do, though? He worked another 7 years because he loved Rachel. And that's who he wanted to be with. This word, and I know we're just now getting to this word in Hebrew is ahava, which means love or attraction. He was so attracted to her, he served 14 years to be able to take her as his wife. Let me tell you this. If we're truly attracted to someone, if we truly love them, if we truly want to keep the romance alive, then folks, we ought to be working for each other and to win one another's hearts for the rest of our lives together. And that's what this love should be about. That's what this love should center around. If someone truly melts your heart, then don't only desire them, but desire what is best for that person. That is how you show romantic love. That's how you keep the romance alive. I love Song of Solomon 7 and verse 10. It simply states, I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Now that's the wife speaking. I'm his, but his desire is for me. And she knew that. Go back and read Song of Solomon. I want to encourage you to do that because that shows the full extent of a love story and the love between a husband and a wife. But a husband and a wife's desire for one another should be compared to the motivation and desire that we have for our God. Would we put everything on the line for them? Would we sacrifice for their own joy and their own happiness? That, folks, is true romance. It's kind of a weird lesson. I know this is long, and I've tried to start doing shorter lessons, but that's not working too well for me. But I wanted to get the full extent of this lesson out as best I could. And it's not a lesson that's easy to offer an invitation after. But this basically is going to close out our lessons on love. I want you to think about that for just a moment. In the grand scheme of things, do you love? And do you show that love to those around you as you should? Do you show love and dedication to God? If you don't, then there's no way that you can be in a right relationship with God. There's no way you can be in a right relationship with the one that you love. And it might mean some things need to change in your life. And if that's the case, we want to help you with a starting point. And that starting point is seeking repentance. That starting point is seeking forgiveness. That starting point is going to God in prayer. And we want to help you do that this morning. But you might be here this morning also and you don't have a relationship with God. The simple truth is, if you haven't committed your life to Him, if you haven't repented of your sins, confessed the name of Christ, and been baptized into Christ to have your sins washed away, you don't have that commitment of true love with God. We want to help you start that commitment, that marriage this morning. We can help you. We've got the water behind us. If you need to come for either of those reasons or other reasons this morning, ask you to come now as we together stand as we sing the song.
There's a fountain